Wealthy rancher pretends to sleep to test the poor widow and freezes seeing what she does. The blizzard made the house crack and groan, so he matched it with stillness, lashes lowered, breath thin. A man feigning sleep to measure truth. Boots whispered in the hallway. A woman slipped inside with a boy wrapped in a threadbare shawl. No lantern, no pleading. She paused at the portraits, then the locked cabinet, then him, one careful look that felt like a question sharpened by hunger. She revived the coals and set a dented tin to warm. From her apron she drew a crust, and stranger still, a folded page bound with blue thread. She studied the page in the firelight and flinched as if ink had teeth. He listened. The boy coughed once. She touched the child's back, counted under her breath, and laid the folded page beside his boots, as if it belonged there. Steam rose. She poured the warmed broth into a chipped cup, raised it to his lips, and tipped only enough to wet them. Not charity, not theft. Something harder to name. Then she did the one thing he did not expect. She slid the blue thread off, unfolded the page, and pressed her thumb over a name written in his dead wife's hand. His lungs forgot the trick of pretending. He kept still anyway. The woman blinked away tears he was not meant to see and whispered, "I'm returning what I was told to return, even if it costs me shelter." She refolded the page with a care usually saved for a deed or a confession, tucked the blue thread in her pocket, and set the cup where his fingers could find it. The door trembled. Wind howled. She gathered the boy and started to leave, then turned back, reached beneath his pillow and slid something there, the weight of a secret against his skull. He waited until her footsteps faded. Then he lifted the pillow and froze in place. Harper Ranch stretched over frozen prairie, like a stern arc, beached on a glittering sea, its corrals rimmed with ice, windmills ticking in jerks, and cottonwoods glazed so heavily that each gust rang through branches like brittle chimes. Inside the big house, beams creaked whenever the north wind shoved at the siding, and long nails answered with faint metallic sighs. Frost feathered the windows until daylight looked sifted, and every door stuck against swollen frames. Elijah Harper rose before dawn anyway, lighting a stub of tallow, shrugging into a shearling coat with seams darkened by years of weather. He liked work that kept his thoughts quiet. While hired men slept in the bunkhouse, he saddled a bay by lantern, checked the creek crossing where drifts crusted over black water, and counted cattle by silhouettes moving like smudges across pale ground. He tugged on the wire where a post leaned, hammered staples with gloved precision, and mended rails himself, even though wages went out to men who could have done the same tasks by noon. Solitude made everything cleaner. The company meant stories, and stories meant old ache. By sunup he circled back, noted hoof ice, hay levels, and a gate hinge that needed a washer, then wiped frost from his mustache with the back of one wrist and rode for the barn with snow hissing beneath shod hooves. Margaret Pike, who had kept this household since his father's time, met him at the mudroom with a towel, a look, and strong coffee carrying a hint of chicory. She said little unless something needed saying, and that reserve had once matched his. In the winter of 1887, though, even Margaret began to fill silences with remarks about the weather, supplies, and the foolish rumors that traveled faster than sleighs. That season changed when the storm nearly swallowed an unfamiliar woman and a boy on the lake. Elijah remembered it as if the scene kept replaying in a frosted mirror. Snow made curtains around two figures trudging from the road, the smaller leaning into the taller, both bent. He opened the door to a whistle of air and saw cheeks scraped raw by cold, a shawl stiff with ice, boots soaked to the stitching. The woman introduced herself as Clara, voice steady but thinning at the edges, and the child clung to her skirt with a numb hand. "Samuel," she added at last, pride threading through exhaustion like wire through burlap. They had walked from town after a promise of work fell through, then lost the light in driven snow, and kept going because stopping meant more than discomfort. Elijah studied that pride, the straight lift of her chin despite chattering teeth, and the way she refused the coin Margaret tried to press into her palm. She asked only for shelter and a chance. She would not sit until Samuel had a blanket. Margaret, suspicious by habit, warmed broth while watching with narrowed eyes, and Elijah felt wary concern. Something in Clara's gaze, a guarded brightness, snagged him. He offered work that would not feel like charity, cleaning where dust gathered above beams, cooking for a household that ate early and late, keeping laundry moving across a line near the kitchen stove. Clara accepted with soft thanks. Samuel thawed slowly in the rocking chair while she fed him careful spoonfuls and urged small sips between them. She dried his socks near the hearth and turned her own pair inside out to steam, then began sweeping as if the job had started already. By morning, the house carried a different order. Clara moved with deliberate economy, stacking kindling by thickness, easing the stove damper until smoke ran true, scrubbing wood with vinegar and hot water that smelled sharp and clean. She learned which boards complained underfoot, how to lift the latch to keep it from barking, how Margaret liked jars labeled and flour tied shut with blue string. Samuel shadowed her steps, eyes lifting often toward Elijah with shy uncertainty that gave way to small smiles whenever the rancher nodded. At breakfast, the boy sat straight on the bench, hands folded until permission came, then ate with steady attention, leaving crumbs gathered in a neat ring on his plate. Elijah absorbed those details the way he tended fences, quietly, with a mind that catalogued. He noticed mended seams at Clara's cuffs, a careful braid, and the way she spared fat for pastry, yet made sure the men's plates carried weight. He noticed too Margaret's set jaw. The housekeeper had seen plenty of arrivals that wilted once labor began, and she disliked any change she had not planned. In private, she told Elijah that grief softened judgment. His answer stayed mild. Work would decide. Days stacked, each shaped by coal. Elijah rode the fence line, checked stock at the windbreak, and kept on mending rails himself when storms made men slower. At noon, he took coffee in the barn and thought about the house breathing behind frosted panes, where a widow kept order with quiet hands, and a boy learned the ranch clock by chores. Evening brought another pat. He ate at the long table while hired men finished in the kitchen, then stepped aside so Clara and Samuel could eat near the stove, a compromise between hospitality and the hard edge inside him that resisted the soft press of company. After dishes rattled dry and boots lined up under pegs, the house settled into a hush that made every seam speak. That hush invited a troublesome curiosity. So he tried a small experiment, one he told no one about, not even Margaret. He lay on a narrow cot in the side room off the kitchen, loosened his collar, and let his breathing slow until it matched the measured pace of sleep. He wanted to know how people behaved when nobody watched. When the clock ticked past midnight, the floor creaked. Clara crossed the room. He could tell by the even steps and the soft brush of fabric along the doorway. She never opened drawers. She never handled coins in the dish near the base. She lifted the blanket to adjust it when wind found him through a gap at the sill, stoked embers until a low glow filled the ash bed, and set a cup of water within reach. Then she whispered prayers, quiet lines braided out of loss and stubborn belief. Some nights he caught her asking for courage to keep the place that winter, to prove value without begging, to give Samuel calm. Other nights he heard only gratitude for heat and work. On a Friday, Margaret surprised him by admitting that the new woman kept an honest kitchen, yet suspicion did not fade. People can hold two truths at once, the housekeeper told him, kindness and hunger for advantage, and only pressure shows which one wins. Pressure arrived when a north gale pushed sleet through every crack. The bunkhouse kept men huddled. Travel from town stalled. The yard disappeared under sheeted drifts. Elijah spent the day chopping ice away from the pump handle and stringing a rope from the porch to the barn for safety. When he came in blue with a cold, Clara already had bricks heating near the oven, towels ready, and broth steaming in a dented pot. Samuel brought the warmed bricks wrapped in cloth to the side room while trying very hard not to Elijah thanked him and watched the boy beam as if given a larger job. Later, when the gale made rafters thrum, Clara went about late chores with that same measured care, wiping condensation from sills, turning boots upside down to drain, counting Samuel's breaths until sleep arrived, and smoothing the cot blanket while she thought he slept. Her palm hovered above his forehead for a second as if testing the air itself. He wondered then what history put that instinct in her hand. Margaret noticed none of it. The housekeeper, fixed on propriety, remained cool toward any bond forming under her roof. She warned that dependence could masquerade as gratitude, and that every pretty act had another purpose tucked beneath it. The warning stung, because a shard of it had once been true in his life. Still, the results argued otherwise. Nothing went missing. The pantry lock stayed untroubled. The stove ran cleaner. Tools returned to their hooks. Samuel began greeting men by name and receiving careful replies, as if the bunkhouse understood that little boys deserve gentleness no matter how hard winter gets. One evening, Elijah found a drawing by the lamp, crude lines showing a tall man with a hat, a small figure holding a rope, and a horse shaped like a cloud. Samuel, face bright, claimed authorship without words by hovering near the paper until approval came. Night after night, the pattern held, a quiet rhythm shaping the house, the way wind carves drifts along the corrals. After dishes dried and boots waited under pegs, Clara walked with a shaded lamp, Samuel dozing on the pallet, Margaret aloud by the stove, and Elijah on the narrow cot in the side room, breathing steady, eyes closed, listening for the truth in footsteps. She adjusted the damper, eased ashes until a low glow steadied in the firebox, set a cup within reach, and smoothed the blanket with a tug that never disturbed his pose. When colder gusts pressed through the sill, she slid a warmed brick near his feet and tucked the edge higher, a precise motion learned from years of tending others while asking nothing in return. He measured these small mercies the way he measured fence lines, tallying not debts but consistencies. By the third week her visits felt woven into the timbers. She moved with the humility of a guest and the calm of someone who knew the difference between charity and earned shelter, leaving each room straighter than before, leaving the air quieter. He told himself the test would end when he found pretense, yet every night dissolved that expectation and left him wondering what he hoped to catch. On a Tuesday, when sleet rattled against glass like dry seed in a pan, the rhythm shifted. Clara brushed crumbs from the table, checked that the button jar was latched, then crossed to the desk where Elijah kept his letters, pencils, sealed envelopes, and an orderly stack of receipts. She rested her palm on the wood, as though asking permission. From her apron, she drew a small folded page tied with blue thread. He heard the breath she caught, and resisted the urge to open his eyes. Her whisper was almost a prayer, almost a promise. "You'll find that." She set the note on the desk, and left the room without looking back, lamp halo thinning as she passed through the doorway. He waited until the house settled, then sat up, lit the lamp, and opened the page with both hands. The handwriting slanted right, careful yet brisk. "Miss Harper, your kindness saved us. I pray you find peace." Nothing more. No plea, no explanation, no return address scribbled at the bottom. Heat from the chimney warmed the paper while he stared until the ink blurred. He folded the note and slid it into the ledger's back pocket among columns of hay, salt, nails, and wages, as if a sentence about mercy belonged beside sums that measured weather against labor. He blew out the flame and lay down again, but the room had changed. Gratitude carried a weight he did not know where to set. The next evening brought a smaller offering. Samuel rose with the exaggerated stealth of a child sure of mischief, padded to the desk on sock feet, and set down a drawing folded twice to protect the lines. After a long glance toward the cot, he held a finger to his lips, even though he believed the man asleep, then tiptoed back and burrowed under the quilt with the grave dignity only children manage. When silence returned, Elijah unfolded the paper and found a tall figure in a hat beside a square barn, and a bay with legs like fence posts. He recognized himself only because the drawn mouth curved upward. The surprise made him feel unarmored, seen in a way that did not demand a defense. He folded the drawing carefully and tucked it with the note, understanding that both gifts had asked nothing and expected nothing. Clara's voice softened around Samuel in a way that made the room less brittle. While she braided his hair, she taught rules about courage and decency without parading them as lessons. When he rummaged for a token to repay Margaret for an extra biscuit, Clara caught his hand and said, kindness doesn't need thanks, then added, kindness just keeps going, with a light touch at his wrist that calmed him better than any lecture. She soothed him through coughing with slow circles between the shoulders, counted softly until the spell passed, and then set him to tracing letters on scrap paper. Elijah, who had once convinced himself that solitude made judgment sharper, learned instead that proximity made nuance visible. Have you ever felt a stranger's kindness touch your heart? Hold that feeling close. By week's end, winter tightened its grip, and neighbor talk moved across the flats faster than a good horse. James Colton arrived with a knock and a grin that carried weather and judgment in equal measure. He owned pasture along the south fence and traded news for profit. Over coffee by the kitchen door, he said he had seen the widow and her boy at the mercantile counting coins twice, speaking gently, standing near the window as if avoiding shadow. Then he tilted the cup and let the rumor slide out like oil. A woman who was grateful might be clever, and clever women found ways to live easily inside generous houses. He smiled as though the thought were a favor. Elijah's jaw set and eased. He told James the ranch hired labor when labor earned its keep, and left it there. James lifted his brows with theatrical concern and added that grief muddies sums and lets nimble hands reach where they should not. He recommended safeguards: move the money drawer, lock the pantry, and insist on chaperoned trips, advice gleaned from performance. Elijah showed him the door with politeness honed by years of necessary diplomacy and watched sleigh tracks fade under spindrift. Margaret echoed the warning after the latch fell, not from spite, but from long practice guarding the house. She recited small changes as if compiling a ledger: new warmth in rooms, orderly baskets, Samuel greeting hands by name and receiving fond reply. She said scandal loves winter and idleness, and that tongues cut because there is little else to do. Keep your head, she added, wiping the table in tight arcs, because people confuse comfort with acclaim. The sentence stung because an old shard of it had once proved true. He answered mildly and let the matter rest in words, though it did not rest in him. Clara worked through the noise without naming it. She ironed shirts with a flat iron heated on the stove lid, pressed seams until the cloth looked stronger, tucked loose threads, and met Margaret's look with courteous steadiness. When she needed flour, she asked in a tone that respected the order already. With Samuel, she practiced letters using a stub pencil and paper salvaged from the end of an account book, sounding out E for Elijah and H for Harper with a solemnity that made the kitchen feel warmer than the fire did. Nights resumed their cadence. Elijah pretended sleep, yet found pretense harder to hold because gratitude wanted a voice he did not trust to remain even. So he watched without watching. Clara never touched the money drawer, never pried at the pantry lock, always counted Samuel's breaths, and paused at the desk as if remembering she had left a piece of herself under the blot. Once her hand hovered above his brow, testing the air for heat, a gesture she withdrew quickly, embarrassed by compassion no one had requested. He lay still and tried to breathe like a man who did not want to speak. News from James reached the bunkhouse by Sunday. Men pretended indifference yet weighed glances. Two offered to escort Clara to town so boundaries would be visible. Elijah gave them other errands because the theater felt like surrender. Margaret pulled between caution and reluctant respect, tightened pantry rules, then, ashamed of suspicion, slipped Samuel an extra spoon of molasses when no one watched. Toward week's end, sleigh bells sounded distant and wind traced new music along the beach. Clara tucked Samuel in with a tale about a bird that built a hidden nest under a bridge, then moved to the desk again. She touched the ledger where her note lay, and smiled a little, not with victory but with relief that words had found a safe pocket. She left a scrap of mended cuff beside the pencil, threads clipped short, proof that repair can be quiet and thorough. Elijah heard every small act and understood that trust grows like frost on glass, first faint then flowering, not because anyone commands it, but because breath keeps meeting cold and making pattern. He did not answer gossip with speeches, only with attention. He rose earlier to check the creek crossing, salted the path to the barn so Clara would not slip, and oiled a hinge Margaret had grown used to ignoring. He kept the note and drawing near the ledger, not as trophies, as compass points, reminders that a household can be steered by gratitude rather than fear. When he lay down again and the stove ticked as iron cooled, he understood that loneliness had not been caution. It had been shelter worn. The wind thickened from a steady moan to a grinding roar that shoved ice into every seam of the house, turned hinges into teeth, and planed the yard until fences looked half-buried. Before dawn, Elijah stepped onto the porch and felt sleet sting his face like thrown sand. By noon, the world had narrowed to a white tunnel from kitchen door to barn rope, each breath burning. He salted the steps, beat ice from the pump handle, checked the lantern line, and pulled the guide rope tight so a hand could find the way even when sight failed. Near evening, with drifts rising and the yard groaning under weight, the stove gave a tired tick and the rooms dimmed to a pewter hush. Margaret lined kettles on the iron, jaw set, eyes red from smoke, while Samuel stacked kindling with grave care and tried not to cough. Clara kept moving, though the air seemed to thicken around her. She measured flour, skimmed stock, and tied a cloth around the kettle handle to guard small fingers from blistering heat. A patch of color drained from her cheeks as the gale found a crack near the sill. Elijah said they would eat early and keep to rooms close to the stove. Clara nodded, reached for a spoon, and swayed. The spoon clicked against the pot, then slid from her grip. She caught the edge of the table, missed, and fell to the floor as if the strength had been pulled out of her by a rope. Samuel cried out, a short sound like a bird striking glass. Elijah crossed the distance in 2 strides. The heat from the stove met the cold around the door in a vicious knot that made the room swim. He lifted her shoulders, felt fire under her skin, and saw the sweat standing on her brow despite the draft. Her lips shaped a word, not his name, only the one that owned her. Samuel. Margaret stood frozen, hand around a ladle, eyes wide with fear, and an old rule that said boundaries hold houses together. Elijah set that rule aside as if it were kindling. Blankets, he ordered, voice low but edged. Water, bricks, towels, move. Margaret moved. Samuel clung to his mother's skirt until Elijah gently pried his fingers free and pressed the boy's hand to his own coat sleeve, promising steady ground. Then he slid his arms beneath Clara and lifted. She weighed less than he expected, all resolve and bone, heat rolling off her like a second storm. Her head tipped against his chest, and a dry whisper scraped out, "Please don't send us away." Elijah kept his stride even though the words, "You're staying," he said, and the answer came out rough, pulled through gravel. He carried her down the hall to the guest room that faced the cottonwoods, a space kept neat because Margaret liked order even in rooms unused. He set Clara on the bed, pulled quilts down, and worked boots loose, while snow rattled the pane. Margaret arrived with a basin steaming and cloths folded tight. Her mouth had formed a line as straight as a fence rail. Elijah didn't look up. Hot water by the stove, more in 10 minutes, bricks wrapped, and send Tom for the doctor if the lane holds, he said, and when Margaret began to speak about propriety, he gave her a look that belonged to a man who buried a wife and did not intend to bury a guest. Silence followed like obedience. He wrung a cloth, laid it across Clara's brow, and watched the steam rise off fevered skin. Samuel stood at the threshold, lower lip trembling, fists balled at his sides as if fists could hold back the weather. Elijah crouched so they shared one line of sight. "We are going to help your mother," he said. "You can help by bringing the small blue cup from the kitchen and the spoon that looks like a bird's beak." Tasks made courage possible. Elijah turned back to the bed and felt time shift under his feet because once, in another winter, a different fever had tightened a room like a vise. A memory rose unbidden, a bowl cooling too quickly, a hand slipping from his, a voice that thanked him for the weather even as it lost name. He pressed the cloth to Clara's temples until his own knuckles blanched and tried to hold the present still. Margaret returned with blankets warmed near the oven and bricks wrapped in towels. She tucked one at Clara's feet and another by her side, every motion precise. Her eyes flicked toward Elijah's hands with something less rigid than earlier, perhaps respect, perhaps worry for what neighbors would say. He watched breath patterns, counted, learned the pauses, and changed clothes when heat banished coolness. The storm beat steadily against the wall. Clara muttered in pieces, sentences stitched from fear and promise, most of them shaped into one plea: keep Samuel safe. Elijah answered aloud each time, although she could not hear. "He is safe," he said. "He belongs under this roof tonight, and tomorrow too." Margaret paused, then placed a small bottle of willow bark on the table. "For fever," she said, and left it there without advice. Samuel returned with the blue cup, held it like an offering, and asked if he should sit where his mother could see him when she woke. Elijah placed a chair at the bedside and set the boy there with instructions to count heartbeats by finger taps. Counting steadied both of them. Hours stretched, punctuated by kettle whistles and the mournful thud of a loose shutter. At some point, Margaret tried again to shape the situation into rules. She stood in the doorway, apron damp, and said that a woman sleeping in the guest room, under a widower's roof, would send talk across the flats faster than sleigh bells. Elijah did not soften. "Let's talk freeze," he answered. "She is not moving from this bed." Propriety wilted under the heat of necessity, and Margaret lowered her eyes, then went to fetch more wood with a kind of brisk grace that looked like surrender to fact. Clara's fever climbed and then held, a narrow ridge that turned every minute into labor. Elijah spooned water to lips that barely parted, wiped her face, and rubbed circles along her forearms when shivers struck. He kept his voice even, named ordinary things: hay, salt, the creek bend, the slow horse with ideas above its station, because ordinary things had once pulled another soul through a night that tried to take her. Toward dawn her heat eased, the fever broke, and breath found a calmer pace. "When was the last time you cared for someone without expecting anything back? It changes you." The words rose unplanned in his chest like prayer, not spoken to the room, spoken to the dark shape inside him that had mistaken distance for strength. By midday gossip rode the flats. James Colton sneered at town. Margaret repeated warnings, and Elijah felt resolve with an undertow of doubt. It needled him. Brown water tore at the creek bank until sod slumped and vanished, turning the draw to a rushing throat that roared over roots, fence posts, and a gate chain ripped free during the night. Rain came in hard sheets, as if the sky had been planed open. Elijah jammed his hat low, swung into the saddle, and drove the bay toward the lower pasture, where cattle bawled and milled near a gouged edge that hadn't existed yesterday. The horse slogged through muck to the knees. Every step sent a cold up his bones. He cut a path with the rope, shouted, swung wide, and pressed the herd uphill, fixing a choke point with a dropped rail and a hasty splice of wire. When a steer tried to bolt across the flooded bend, he snapped the rope around a post, leaned back with everything he had, and turned the animal with a jerk that burned his palms. The creek spat debris, planks, a busted barrel, a dead branch forked like an antler, and slammed each piece against the bank as if testing what deserved to remain. Lightning ran a white seam across the cloud, thunder followed, and the wind took his breath. He didn't think about accounts or talk, or any rule fitted for clearer days. He thought about knots that don't slip, ground that won't give way, and faces he could not lose. A cry rose behind him. Not cattle, not wind. He whipped around and saw two figures along the ridge above the wash: Clara, pale under soaked wool, and Samuel wrapped to the chin, both pushed sideways by gusts, so mean they seemed sharpened. Fever had emptied her days ago, yet she moved anyway, jaw set, eyes locked on the small storm shelter cut into limestone near the cottonwoods. Between her and safety, a section of path had grown slick as soap. Elijah's mouth went dry. "Stay on the high side," he shouted. The gale caught his words and threw them back, but she heard enough to shift her weight uphill. The creek surged again, undercutting the lip. A slab of clay slid away with a sucking sound, leaving a fresh rim no wider than a boot sole. Samuel clutched her neck, legs cinched around her waist, blanket heavy with rain. She reached for a sapling, missed, found it on the second try, and held while mud crawled over her shoes. "Shelter!" Elijah yelled, pointing past the cottonwoods, then turned the bay toward the herd, because the line had started to bow, and if that broke loose the whole slope would churn to ruin. He shoved through the muck, jammed the rope around another post, hauled two cows out of the cut with a sweep and a curse, then tied a half-hitch he could trust and ran. The horse slid and scrambled. Elijah swung down before the hooves found a hole, shoved the reins through a ring, and took to the ridge in long steps that tore his breath into ragged strips. Clara had moved 10 paces and lost 7. The sapling bent to a groan. The path shivered. "Don't look down," he called, voice hoarse. 2 more steps and reach." She didn't answer. She set Samuel on her hip higher, shifted her stance, and eased forward the width of a thumb. The creek lunged. Her boots skated. She slipped, slammed one knee, slid toward the cut, and stopped only because that little tree refused to quit. Samuel gasped, but didn't scream. His face had the stunned brightness of a child who understands that noise might break the balance. Elijah dropped to his belly, shoved his boots into the grass for purchase, and stretched until his shoulder shrieked. "Give me his hand." She lifted the boy an inch. Elijah reached farther. Fingers brushed, slipped, caught. He hauled Samuel across the rim with a grunt that tasted like iron. The boy's arms latched around his neck, small heart thudding against his collarbone. Elijah set him on the safe side, belly down, palms flat. "Stay," he said, and Samuel stayed. "Now you," he said to Clara. She shook her head hard, eyes on the child. "Move," he said flat, because there wasn't room for courtesy. She let go of the sapling with one hand, reached, missed, reached again, and found his wrist. Mud poured around her like a hand closing. He pulled, she pushed. The ground clenched and tried to take her shoe. The bank sloughed another inch. He lunged, got a fistful of coat, and dragged boots furrowing the sod, while rain nailed the back of his neck. For a second everything held in a balance that felt like a held breath at a graveside. Then the coat moved, her knee cleared, her hands found grass, and she came up with a sound that wasn't quite a sob, and wasn't speech, only life answering life. He didn't let go until they were 3 strides from the edge. "Storm shelter," he said, pointing. "Door bar. Go." She nodded, staggered, straightened, and gathered Samuel under one arm, while Elijah took the other side. Together they stumbled toward the low limestone door cut into the slope decades back for nights like this. The wind shoved, the creek roared, cattle groaned behind them, but the line held because he had tied it to hold. At the door he shoved the heavy plank up and in, pushed it through, dropped the bar, and stood with his back against it, while the first long shake ran through his legs. Inside smelled of old dust and stone damp. A shelf held 2 candles, and a tin of matches. He struck one, cupped it, and watched the flame steady in a small gold bowl of light. Samuel's lips shook. Clara's lashes clumped. Water ran from their clothes onto the stone, and gathered in a small lake near the threshold. He wrapped one blanket around the boy, and another around Clara, then wrapped his arms around both, as if heat could be braided from 3 bodies, the way rope is made by twisting smaller strands together until they learn each other and refuse to fail. "You should be in bed," he tried, breath still ragged, and heard relief break his own scold. "We were going to the shelter," she said softly. The path broke. She pressed her forehead to Samuel's hair as if a private prayer belonged there. Thunder walked overhead like a herd crossing a bridge. Rain hammered the roof slab. He thought of the cot, the note in the ledger, and the child's drawing of a man with a smile he had not expected to wear. Words rose, and he didn't fight them. "You're my family now," he said, low and certain, the truth of it shocking him by how natural it felt in his mouth. Clara froze, eyes rising to meet his. Surprise flickered, then doubt, then a stubborn hope that had survived storms colder than this. Her chin trembled once. She didn't answer with speeches. Her hand found his forearm and stayed. Outside, something heavy tore loose and crashed into the drawer. Spray hissed. The door shivered in its frame and held. He thought of the rumor and refused to care. He thought of vows made without witnesses and found them weightier than any speech delivered in a church. In chaos, have you ever found what truly matters? Hold it tight. The thought felt like a candle placed inside his chest, where a hearth had been cold too long. Samuel leaned back and peered up through clumped lashes. "Are you crying?" he asked. No mockery, just the clean wonder of a child counting new weather. Elijah blinked hard and laughed, a broken, real sound that startled him with how much ease it brought. "Might be the rain found its way in," he said, wiping his cheek, which only made the boy grin and Clara breathe a shaky answering laugh. They sat that way while the creek raged, and the wind spent itself beating stone. Elijah told a ridiculous story about a stubborn colt that refused puddles, but marched across rivers if someone sang loud and flat. Samuel tried to sing, and failed, and tried again. Clara rested her head against Elijah's shoulder and didn't move away. The candle guttered, brightened, steady. After a long while the thunder rolled farther west. The roar softened, and the door stopped quivering. He cracked it, peered out, and saw the herd clumped on the high ridge. The rope fence bowed but whole, the worst of the flood sliding past with fewer claws. Mudlines on fences marked where the water had climbed, then fallen, leaving silt, driftwood, and a smell of turned earth. The creek murmured, the roar gone, and work returned like a stern teacher with a slate of chores. Elijah swung a hammer while Clara steadied posts, speaking little because effort conveyed enough. Their glances formed shorthand. Pass nails, hold that brace, mind the slick patch near the willow. Samuel gathered scattered buckets and set them upright as if order could calm the shaken ground. By noon, they straightened a section of fence and freed a gate chain from weeds. Clara wiped her palms, breathed damp storm, and smiled. Elijah answered by lifting the last rail. Silences no longer pinched. They felt like quilts shared by people who knew winter's weight. Inside, Margaret boiled water and aired quilts, saying little except when a task required precision. Her restraint softened by respect. By late afternoon, the yard looked less wounded. Ruts remained, boards leaned, yet the house stood steadier. In the evening, Elijah sorted tack while Clara mended a strap, the boy tracing letters on a saved ledger page. Quiet rose around them that felt earned. Still, talk moved faster than repair. James Colton visited the mercantile and let remarks drop like tacks. The rancher had grown soft. The widow had found a warm nest. Reputations tilted easier than wagons in mud. Whispers quickened. Clara heard two women near the salt barrels speak low while measuring sugar. Kindness breeds expectation. Men forget caution when a skirt sits near the stove. She kept her hand steady, counted coins, thanked the clerk, and walked back with flour in one arm and Samuel's hand in the other, wind lifting stray hair across her cheek. The words did not break her posture. They tempered it. Resolve set like a seam under a hot iron. That evening, she told Elijah she had heard town talk. Her tone stayed calm, yet watchfulness settled behind her eyes. I will not ask you to defend me, she said. I understand what people think when they see a widow near a widower's kitchen. He leaned against the bench, hands dark with oil. I do not trade in gossip, he answered. No one else will write this house's account. She nodded, then opened a guarded ledger. I married a gambler, she said. Eyes on the kettle rim. He promised that luck would turn. It turned the wrong way. Debts piled. A night ended with a bottle broken and fists thrown. He went down and did not rise. I buried the dream, took the boy, and ran before someone claimed us as collateral. The stove ticked. She continued, softer. A creditor waited near our door at dawn. I left that hour with a shawl, a small tin, and Samuel hugging my side. Winter chased us into your lane. She folded her hands, not pleading, only closing a book others had kept open. Elijah listened. I loved a woman who made weather sound like a friend, he said at last. Illness took her slow enough to teach me every rung between hope and acceptance. After the funeral, I built work around the silence because I knew nothing else to build. Understanding crossed between them like a plank over running water. Samuel, half asleep on the pallet, pressed his face into the quilt. Margaret entered, gathered cups and paused at the stillness. A small nod admitting something had taken root beyond utility. Thunder far away rolled like distant wagons. Not a threat, just a memory. Morning brought errands. Elijah needed salt and a hinge washer. Clara wanted yeast and thread, the color of late wheat. At the store, a clerk lifted his chin while three men tightened their circle by the stove. Colton lounged near the seed bins, hat tipped, eyes bright with malice trimmed as concern. Need more locks, he asked. The door works, Elijah said. Some doors open without keys when hearts grow soft. Colton added. Clara kept her gaze on the pad, signed for flour, refused the bait. Outside, the sky looked scrubbed blue. She stopped at the rail, parcel to her chest. If staying ruins your name, say so, she said. I will pack and go before noon. Resolve steadied her voice. Elijah answered without negotiation. Reputation matters less than truth, he said. Truth is, this place works better with you here, and I am done pretending that is an accident. Her breath sounded like someone stepping from shade into sun. Back at the ranch, they hung clothes on the new line and set a kettle to dye a rope bleached by floodwater. Work reclaimed rhythm. Margaret watched from the porch, then joined with a tub of clothespins, her mouth softer than it had been in months. Under her breath she admitted peace had crept into halls that once echoed too loudly, then masked the confession by teaching Samuel how to ring without twisting cloth to ruin. Days gathered. Elijah and Clara scraped silt from floorboards, planed a warped door, stacked split logs under a tin, and laughed once when a chicken knocked a pail. The boys' drawings filled a nail by the window, a horse with better legs, a sunrise shaped like a wheel, 3 figures under a cottonwood. At dusk, Elijah repaired a lantern while Clara read a psalm, whose cadence felt like a hand smoothing rough grain. The words sounded practical, a blueprint for endurance. Later, she folded the page and stored it like a tool. When stars lifted above the cottonwoods, a crisp scent drifted in, and the house settled with a satisfied creak. Clara poured tea and looked toward the door. "If you want me to go," she said again, "say it tonight so the road can find us early." He set the lantern down and held her gaze for a long, unhurried beat. "Stay," he said, "not as a maid, as a partner. Share accounts, decisions, harvest risk, rest. Let the boy claim this yard as his schoolyard. Let the walls know our names at the same time." Relief rose quiet and strongly. She touched his hand. Margaret, listening from the pantry, closed the door on a satisfied sigh she later blamed on the hinge. In town, Colton kept spitting poison, but wind dilutes stubborn smoke. Men who had seen the flood's edge remembered who threw ropes and who hauled bodies from the cut. Women measuring flour beside Clara noticed steady coin, lack of complaint, refusal to trade on pity. Slowly, the tale shifted, as it does when deeds outrun words. Under that change within walls, learning new music, Elijah and Clara worked side by side, through days that asked for patience and nights that offered rest. Shared scars no longer raw, a future no longer rumor, a bond as solid as the posts they set in fresh earth. Margaret set an extra place at supper without comment, and Samuel fell asleep before the plates cooled. One hand curled around a wooden horse. Elijah carved that afternoon. Beyond the windows, the creek whispered over stones. The ranch breathed easy inside. Confidence replaced caution, and the promise they had spoken began to feel like weather turning. Clara moved through the gentler weather like a careful traveler, reading ice, testing trust with quiet steps, never pretending the thaw erased danger. She kept work steady and speech measured, gathering laundry from the porch rail before the wind turned it stiff, rubbing lard along the stove door so it closed without a squeal, setting Samuel to count spoonfuls of flour until he could read the scale. Moments of ease came and went like shy birds. She would laugh at something small, the way a hen scolded a bucket, the face Samuel drew on an onion, and then catch herself as if joy might bring a collector to the door. Elijah felt the break inside that pause and refused to crowd it. He let patience speak for him, fixing a sagging hinge before she asked, sanding a burr from the banister, tightening a loose peg on the rocker where she read at night. He knew pressure could bruise even tender fruit. Space, handled well, could be its own shelter. Samuel bridged what distance remained, with gifts that carried a child's simple accuracy. He pinned a new drawing above the desk, 3 figures beneath a cottonwood, the tallest in a hat, the middle with a braid, the smallest waving a crooked hand that seemed to move if you blinked. Another afternoon, he presented Elijah with a horse he had carved from pine under the bunkhouse light, whittled ears uneven, but upright, legs stout, tail a small arc of shaved curls. "For you," he said, trying to appear casual while his eyes hunted for approval. Elijah set the little horse on the ledger ledge, where the sun could catch it, lifted Samuel high enough to touch the beam, and told him it stood as straight as any bay he had ever trained. Later, when work thinned and dusk pulled long shadows across the floor, Clara found Elijah in the study, not lying on the cot, not arranging his breath like a man asleep, but sitting at the desk with the lamp turned low, reading the margins of old accounts as though columns could answer questions that had nothing to do with grain or salt. She lingered at the doorway, spine straight, hands folded around a thread spool she had forgotten to set down. He looked up. The movement brought neither surprise nor rehearsal. No games, only a man in a room that had learned how to hold silence without sharpening it. "You're awake," she said, voice softer than steam and steadier than she felt. "I am," he answered, with a half-smile that traveled no farther than the corners of his eyes. She stepped inside, set the spool beside the little horse, and let the quiet stand between them like a table already set. "Sometimes I think your kindness is a rope," she said, "tied to a thing that could pull me toward shore if I trust it not to break." He rested his forearms on the desk, as if bracing an honest load. "I kept the house frozen because the heat hurt," he said. "You warmed it by moving, not by promising. That taught me more than words. What you've done here, what the boy has done, brought back a sound I had locked outside." She waited. The match burned low, and he blew it out. The lamplight slowed to a gold hush. "Hope," he added, almost embarrassed by the size of the word in such a modest room. She drew a breath fast and quiet, the kind a body takes on a ledge. "I know what it costs to open a door," she said. "The last time I believed a voice that gentle, I ended up counting debts in the dark with a child asleep on my skirt. Every kindness felt like a ledger line with interest due later." He nodded, more grave than wounded. "I can't promise a world that never breaks," he said. "I can promise that when it breaks, my hands will be on the same side as yours." Something eased then, not dramatically, more like a knot sliding under steady finger. She reached forward until her hand rested on the desk corner, ring finger touching the pine horse's back. He laid his palm near hers without closing the distance, letting her decide. She narrowed that gap until skin met skin, a brief, clean contact that carried more weight than hours of talk. They did not hold on. They did not flinch. They simply acknowledged the bridge they had both helped build plank by plank without witnesses. Footsteps sounded in the hall. Margaret appeared with a folded shawl, paused as if she had walked into a chapel by mistake, then crossed the threshold with deliberation that felt like consent. "Draft rises late over the floorboards," she said, draping the wool across Clara's shoulders with a touch that was brisk but warm. No sense letting good work stiffen. The gesture rewrote 6 months of guarded posture in an instant, not erasing caution, simply placing a hand on its shoulder and steering it toward a chair near the fire. Clara thanked her, voice. Margaret, who rarely granted words to feelings, cleared her throat and busied herself with the lamp, hiding a small smile in the glass's reflection. The house breathed differently afterward. Sound carried farther without turning sharp. The rockers stopped groaning because someone had rubbed wax into the runners. Bread came out of the oven at the precise minute it wanted, though no clock had announced the change. At the barn, the bay tossed its mane as if acknowledging that stable hands hummed less to fill emptiness and more to share a tune already playing. Even the pump handle, once chronic with complaint, worked smoothly under a new washer. Life stitched itself from ordinary threads into something quietly strong. Yet beyond the cottonwoods, rumor kept walking. James Colton let new stories fall like ash over town, each flake harmless alone, choking when gathered. He said Elijah kept a widow in his study after sundown, that money walked from a drawer without feet, that a boy called a rancher father before vows had been spoken, that pity dissolved a man's resolve. He spoke with the false sadness of someone who loves a cautionary tale more than the neighbor it wounds. Some ears closed, some entertained, some repeated for sport. A drover snickered near the saddle rack. 2 women at the mercantile invented glances that neither had seen, then purchased ribbon and carried the gossip home tucked under bread. Elijah heard scraps and chose work over rebuttal. Clara heard worse and refused to fold under it, though she slept lighter when wind drove small objects against the clapboard, as if stones might follow noise. Samuel sensed a cloud he could not name. He answered it by doubling down on generosity, penciling new drawings with bright sun wheels, carving a second horse for Margaret with a tail even more fanciful than the first, placing it on her pantry shelf without announcement. She found the little creature at dawn and stood a long time at the door, fingertips on the smooth pine. Softness reached corners that habit had kept armored. That night she set an extra biscuit on Samuel's plate and pretended she had miscounted, a small mercy that landed with the weight of a handshake. One evening, while sleet tapped a thin rhythm on the glass and the creek spoke under ice, Clara returned to the study and found Elijah again awake, ledger open, pen idle. This time, neither hovered. She took the chair opposite and folded the shawl across her lap. They reviewed nothing larger than the day: a hinge that would need replacing, a calf with a stubborn ear, a letter Margaret intended to send to a cousin when roads cleared. Then the talk slipped past chores and into the gently perilous ground where stories begin. He told her how dawn on the ridge now looked like a road instead of a grave marker, how the sound of a child's pencil could drown a memory that had once ruled the room. She told him that trust felt like learning to breathe again after running too far, that every hour in which nobody knocked to collect something due felt like a field spared by hail. They did not promise futures or draft oaths. They folded understanding into the ordinary, sealing it with another brief touch over the desk, palm to palm, as simple as passing a tool. That was enough to carry them to bed and morning. Outside, the neighbors' stories kept their march, threatening the fragile peace not by force but by attrition, a slow erosion that could, if ignored too long, undercut any back. The hard winter loosened its grip, and along the draws the snow sank into dark furrows that bled rivulets toward the creek, leaving mud that held the memory of hooves like stamps pressed into wax. Wind still prowled the prairie, yet warmth hid under it the way coals hide under ash, waiting for a breath. Elijah rose before dawn to salt the last patches of ice on the porch steps, then walked the fence line with tools clinking, testing splices, whispering to skittish yearlings, while Clara set dough to rise and mended a halter strap at the kitchen table where steam fogged the window in gentle clouds. Samuel trailed between house and barn with a small pail and a wooden horse tucked into his belt, stopping to listen when meltwater chattered through culverts like eager talk after long silence. The ranch, once clenched against the storm, opened its shoulders. Even Margaret, who measured seasons by inventory, let the pantry door rest ajar and stood a slow minute in the doorway to hear calves answer their mothers across the lot. On one clear afternoon, the sky wore a blue so honest it made disbelief feel like waste, and Elijah led Clara past the windbreak to a corner of ground that held his family's graves. A low fence enclosed the quiet place. Iron markers rose from soil scrubbed clean by winter's rough hands. Lichen traced pale maps along names that had taught him how to hold steady in wind. Beside the stones grew a young plum tree he had planted 3 springs earlier, a stick then, now awake, branches tipped with tight buds that looked like small secrets about to speak. He stopped there and felt the old ache step forward as it always did, not to drive him away, only to check whether he had forgotten what love costs. He had not. He turned to Clara, who wore a plain dress and the shawl Margaret had quietly reforged from a quilt, and he took in the way the thaw had returned color to cheeks that winter had bleached pale. Samuel hung back at the gate, sensing that the air there held something sacred, fingers worrying the stem of a wild violet he had picked on the path. Elijah cleared his throat, then found a voice that did not need to be loud. "I planted this tree when I could not imagine another beginning," he said, eyes steady, hand on the post worn smooth by visits. "It lived through blizzard and drought. Seeing it hold on taught me that endurance is its own kind of belief. You came with a boy and a courage I recognized because it looked like what got me through my worst nights. I have tested myself enough for one lifetime. If you will stand with me, I will share labor, shelter, and rest, and I will call your child mine if he will have me." Clara's breath hitched, eyes bright, posture both proud and shaking. She looked at the stones, then at the tree, then at the man who had learned how to listen before speaking. Tears lifted and fell, clean as thaw. She nodded first as if answering a private oath, then spoke aloud. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like a door opening in a house that had been boarded for years. Her hands rose to his, small and sure. Samuel, unable to hold still any longer, pushed the gate, hurried over the mud with careful steps, and thrust the violet between them, as if sealing a pact. Elijah laughed, not with bravado, with relief, and lifted the boy onto his hip while Clara leaned into both, cheek against his shoulder, the plum buds bright above them like lanterns too shy to flare yet. They planned a wedding that would fit the place that had carried them, simple, honest, unadorned by theater. Samuel insisted on duties and announced himself ring-bearer with a solemnity that made Margaret turn away to hide a smile. He practiced carrying a tiny carved box and refused to choose any blossom from the garden rose because wildflowers, he said, remembered how to hold wind. Clara stitched a modest dress from cream cloth, saved in a trunk, added a strip of blue along the hem, and threaded her hair with a ribbon smoothed under the eye. Elijah mended the bench beneath the kitchen window so older guests could rest, planed splinters from the porch rail, and rubbed linseed oil into the door until the grain lifted like lines on a palm, reading itself. Margaret cleaned the stove so it shone, counted plates twice, then set one extra for whoever Providence sent. In town, voices that had loved sharp talking faded as if embarrassed by the sound they had made all winter. Nothing silences idle mouths like consistent evidence. Elijah's resolve did that work without speeches. He appeared with Clara in daylight, paid bills in person, signed both names together on supply orders, and thanked the clerk with courtesy, carrying the weight of steel. Ranch hands mirrored the example by treating Samuel like an apprentice, not a mascot, and by praising Clara's bread the way cowboys praise good weather, matter-of-fact and grateful. "When have you seen love rise from love? Cherish that hope," read a line Clara wrote on a piece of paper that she pinned under a cup by the sink, as if it were a receipt for a debt newly settled. One man refused to release his preferred story. James Colton found them by the corral while Elijah and Clara checked a gate latch. He strolled up with a grin polished to look friendly and said the word wife like a challenge. Elijah did not step back. He set his palm on the top rail and looked at a neighbor who had chosen poison when bread would have cost less. "You may think I forgot prudence," he said calmly, "but I have simply learned that fear cannot be the bookkeeper here. I will not trade decency for your approval." Colton tried a bark of laughter, found no echo, and met the ranch hand's level stare. "Silence, that great judge," decided the exchange. He touched his hat without grace and left with his legend trimmed. News of the encounter reached town with remarkable speed, yet it carried no thrill. It sounded like weather, a front that had passed. On the appointed morning, the sky wore a soft veil, thin clouds filtering light into something tender. The creek talked to stones, gentle for once. Neighbors came on wagons and mules, leaving tracks like braids across damp ground. A cousin of Margaret's read a brief blessing that spoke more of seed and rain than thunder and wrath. Margaret stood near the porch with a warm, unguarded gaze, shawl drawn close. Approval played. Clara walked from the house with Samuel at her side, holding a fistful of prairie blossoms, chin high, bracelets quiet. Elijah waited beneath the plum, whose buds had just begun to open, scattering pale perfume that caught even the hard men off guard. He wore his best shirt and a face honest enough to invite trust. When Clara reached him, they joined hands. He wore his best shirt and met Margaret's warm, unguarded gaze. Clara arrived, they vowed. Laughter rose. Calves nosed rain. Petals drifted from the plum like soft snow, catching in Clara's hair and settling on Elijah's shoulders as morning light poured across the yard and warmed the faces gathered close beneath the branches. A low breeze carried faint perfume over grass, just turning green, and the creek's patient murmur sounded like a hymn. Margaret stood near the porch with a hand resting on the rail, eyes bright, shawl drawn close not from cold, but from tenderness. She rarely showed. Two ranch hands waited a few steps back in clean shirts, hats held at their sides, boots brushed, expressions simple and proud. Nothing glittered, nothing shouted. The day asked only honesty. Clara wore a pale green dress. She had stitched by lamplight, the color catching the sun in a way that made hope look tangible. Elijah faced her in his best shirt, cuffs mended, hair tamed by water and patience, the lines at his eyes softened by relief. Samuel stood between them, holding a tiny box and a fistful of wildflowers he had gathered along the fence, his solemn face barely containing joy. The ceremony needed no stage. A neighbor with a gentle voice and a weathered prayer book spoke a few quiet lines, then stepped aside so promises could belong to the people who had earned them. Elijah took Clara's hands, calluses meeting softness, and his voice came sure without needing force. He promised labor shared, shelter offered without ledger, laughter defended when days grew lean, and honesty kept even when storms returned. Clara answered with words that held both courage and humility, pledging care through worry and calm, guarding peace inside walls that had once known mourning, and honoring the child who stood to her left, whose fierce little heart had bridged distances adults could not cross alone. They exchanged rings without flourish. Elijah's rough fingers trembled only once, then steadied as the band slid into place. Clara breathed in, not sharply, but with a fullness that seemed to open the room of her chest to sunlight it had not carried since long before winter. The kiss that followed needed no performance. It was quiet, complete, grateful. Samuel leaned closer, eyes wide, and whispered into the hush, "Mama looks like spring." Laughter moved through the little circle, soft, unguarded, true. Elijah wiped one eye with the back of his hand, and did not hide it. Whole for the first time in years, he stood beneath the branches, remembering nights when wind shook beams, and faith felt like a rope fraying strand by strand. And he knew that endurance had not brought him here alone. Kindness had found its road through snowdrifts, through suspicion, through gossip that blew across flats and tried to sand the shine from mercy. Between vows and bread, he traced the path that had brought them. A widow's dignity that refused charity yet accepted work. A boy who offered drawing and carved gifts instead of pleading. A housekeeper whose stern guard had softened into blessing. A rancher who had learned to test others by silence and then learned to trust by listening. The morning unfolded with modest comfort. Margaret poured coffee into enamel cups and set out warm bread, butter bright on a chipped plate, jam in a jar that caught light like a ruby. The men lifted the bride on a chair for one slow turn and set her down before she grew embarrassed. Samuel rehearsed his title aloud, ring-bearer becoming a word he wore proudly like a good hat. A pair of calves bawled from the lot and were answered at once. A small chorus that made everyone smile because work and celebration had become one fabric. Later, Clara walked the yard with her husband and son, skirts lifted above damp ground, petals clinging along the hem like tiny signatures. She paused by the stones inside the low fence and pressed her palm to the post, as if speaking thanks into the wood. No grand speeches carried across the pasture, yet the air felt full of declarations that needed no witnesses. Stay, build, forgive. Afternoon, when shadows shortened and conversation thinned into contented quiet, Elijah led Clara and Samuel along the fence line to look upon the ground they would steward together. Posts planted after the flood stood square, wire sang a faint bright note when plucked, and winter's scars showed themselves as lines already healing. He spoke of pasture rotations, shelter belts, water gaps and gates that always needed one more nail than anyone expected. She listened with that attentive stillness he had come to trust, then added thoughts about storing kindling by size, labeling jars, so guests could find what they needed without asking, teaching Samuel to keep a ledger for eggs and butter, so numbers could become a language he would never fear. Margaret joined them on the porch steps and handed Clara a shawl with embroidery along the edge. Not fancy, just a pattern that suggested continuity. "I finished the border before sunrise," she said, almost shy, which made Clara's eyes brim again. The town's loud mouths had grown quiet over the past weeks, not because distance had beaten them, but because discipline had. Elijah had refused drama, answering talk with conduct, letting each day carry proof across the flats until even bored ears preferred silence. When James Colton finally tried one more confrontation, sauntering up to the rail with a smirk that once passed as charm, Elijah met him without heat. He did not list grievances or invite witness. He said only that small men build bonfires of rumor when they cannot bear another's steady light, and then asked James whether he planned to help mend the north gate or return to town and waste daylight. The smirk cracked. The man left. Nothing more needs to be said. In the days leading up to evening, the ranch hummed with work that felt lighter, A mare foaled at dawn beside the windbreak, steam rising from new life while the sun climbed and painted the colt with gold. Fences found straightness under fresh staples. Hinges stopped complaining. The kitchen window became a frame for moments. Samuel sliding a tin soldier along the sill. Margaret tasting stew with a spoon reserved for that single purpose. Clara hanging towels that smelled of soap and thought. Laughter appeared the way birds do after a storm. Tentative, then sure, then everywhere. At sunset on the wedding day, they returned to the plum and stood beneath branches beginning to open. Wind touched blossoms and sent another thin snow drifting over heads and shoulders. A hush within a hush. Elijah thanked the tree aloud for surviving, then thanked the woman who had taught him how to welcome warmth again, then thanked the boy whose fierce little heart had bridged distances two adults could not cross alone. He felt whole, not in a way that denies old scars, but in a way that gives them purpose, turning wounds into maps that keep travelers from the ditches. He held Clara's hand and remembered, without flinching, the cot, the feigned sleep, the folded note, the fever, the flood, the shelter, the confession, the decision. She squeezed back and remembered refusing coin, offering labor, mending hems, whispering prayers no one had asked to hear, and finding an answer where she least expected it. The narrative of their months refused grand banners. It rested on smaller proofs. A door oiled so it no longer woke a sleeping child, a gate latch fixed before trouble started, a thaw carried in a cup toward someone shaking after too much cold. Grief had not vanished. It had been honored and put to work as teacher and guard. Kindness had not asked for praise. It had stayed busy. Love had not sprung fully formed. It had been rebuilt from fragments gathered under pressure, each piece tested by weather, time, and the stubborn will to keep choosing. As dusk deepened and stars peered through a veil of pale cloud, Samuel set the carved box on the table and arranged wildflowers in a cup, then tried to whistle and failed, which made everyone laugh until the sound became a promise. The house began to glow from within. A kettle clicked into readiness, bread cooled. Footsteps crossed familiar thresholds without caution. Windows held streaks from drying towels and fingerprints from small hands. The creak's music threaded every